seen, the Silk Road was a series of interconnected ancient trade routes that connected China with the Mediterranean Sea and with the civilizations of the Mediterranean. It covered more than 5,000 miles by land and sea, and trade along this route was essential for the development of China, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, India, and Rome. It would become the foundation of global trade in the classical, medieval, and early modern periods. They traded things like silk, spices, and horses, salt, different commodities and goods that would become essential to this global trade network. We also saw that the Silk Road traded or created unintentional exchanges of things like religion or disease. For example, the Black Death moved along the Silk Road. So we are very clear that the Silk Road was an incredibly important part of the classical world and was essential to understanding the foundations of world history. But there are other stories from the Silk Road that don't always make it into textbooks, that aren't as well known, but that have nonetheless shaped the world around us. For example, let's talk about the story of apples. So today, apples are one of the most ubiquitous plants on the planet, one of the most ubiquitous fruits in grocery stores across the globe. There are more than 7,500 types of apples. So did you know that the modern apple has its roots on the Silk Road? Specifically in the central part of Asia known as Kazakhstan. Wild apples grew on 60-foot trees in the wilds of Kazakhstan, just west of the Tian Shan Mountains. They would fall from these trees, and travelers along the Silk Road would pick them up and eat them. As they moved along the Silk Road, they would spread the seeds of these apples. And because apples are heterozygous, the falling seeds would spread different types of apples up and down the Silk Road. As they spread west, they crossed with European crab apples, creating varieties of apples that were larger, firmer, a little bit more sour than the Kazakhstan apple. As they spread east, they crossed with other Asian wild apples and crab apples, creating soft, sweet dessert apples. They became an important part of the Roman Empire, and as Rome conquered Europe, these crossed apples would be spread into Europe. They would go as far west as Britain and as far east as China. And when Western Europe conquered the Americas in the Age of Conquest or the Age of Exploration, the Europeans would bring apples to the New World. The genetic diversity of apples allowed them to survive in many climates, creating what we have already identified as the ubiquity of the apple in the modern diet. Or we could tell the story of polo. Polo has long been associated with horsemanship along the Silk Road. Horses were essential to the Silk Road, and one of the ways of using horses in a leisure format was with the playing of sports that resembled the modern game of polo. Its origins have generally been attributed to Central Asia, to Iran and Baltistan, to the region where Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, and Tibet meet. It was introduced to China in the 7th century and became an important part of life at the Dang court. The Chinese transmitted polo, which they called hit ball, to Korea and Japan. And polo horses became an important trade commodity. They became an important trade item for polo-playing Chinese aristocrats. Europe would encounter this game of polo or hit ball as the British took control of India. And this game, which was called buzkashi, was transmitted back to Britain, modified into the more modern concept or modern game of polo that we could identify today, and then transmitted to the United States. Or perhaps we could look at the story of the fiddle. Turkic and Mongolian horsemen from Central Asia were probably the world's first fiddlers. They played hollowed-out gourds and two-stringed upright fiddles, strung with horsehair strings and played with horsehair bows. Over time, those fiddles became increasingly elaborate, often featuring a horse head carved at the end of the neck. In fact, the horsehead fiddle's origins is a legend well known among musicians in Mongolia, and it was transmitted along the Silk Road. According to legend, a herder received the gift of a magical winged horse. He would mount it at night after a long day of tending and herding sheep and fly to distant places to meet his beloved. But the story goes that the woman became jealous of the herder. Had the horse's wings cut off, the horse fell from the air and died, and from its bones the grieving herder made a fiddle on which he played beautiful and poignant songs about his horse. Or maybe we tell the story of Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables are a collection of fables, of stories with learning value. Fables are stories that feature an animal or creature, often anthropomorphized, given human qualities, that offers a moral lesson to the reader. Aesop's fables are generally associated with Aesop, a slave and storyteller believed to have lived in ancient Greece between 620 and 564 BCE. And those stories wouldn't just be contained to Greece, but would spread all along the Silk Road. For example, one of the most famous of Aesop's fables was the story of the man with the goose who laid the golden eggs. And the story goes, there once was a man who owned a wonderful goose. Every morning, the goose laid for him a big, beautiful egg, an egg made of pure, shiny, solid gold. And every morning, the man would collect those golden eggs. And little by little, he began to grow rich. But he also began to grow greedy. He wanted more. My goose has all those golden eggs inside her, he kept thinking. Why not get them all at once? And one day he couldn't take it any longer, so he grabbed the goose and he killed her. But there were no golden eggs inside her. Why did I do that? The man cried. Now there will be no more golden eggs. These stories were transmitted from Greece to Rome, to Europe, to the Americas. Translations have been found in India and China. So these stories were transmitted along the Silk Road, creating this sense, this important sense, in which the global trading network known as the Silk Road shaped the world in which we live, and not just in economic terms. The connections between East and West that developed along this trade route transcended economics and engaged culture, literature, religion, and would become the foundations of the connections between East and West that would serve as the foundation of world history. Thank you.